like saying things that are kind of irrelevant in the first couple seconds of the video to make sure the video is rolling.
Sounds
Um, yeah, become kind of a trademark here.
good.
Um, this is still not. I'm still not actually sure. 1 second here. We can turn that second to 2 seconds. All right, we're good. All right, we're joined here today, or joined here in this moment, by Steve Jobbitt, who is a scholar, professor at the at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Canada, and we're very excited to be joined by him today. He's an expert. He's a scholar of radical right wing politics, and I'm talking too much already. So, Steve, tell us about radical right wing politics, how they come to be, and what are some of the common characteristics that we see internationally.
Well, yeah, thanks. Nice to see you, Matt,
It's good
from
to see
afar.
you. Yeah.
Actually, I'm actually right now in that place in the basement of my house where you stayed when you were here. I don't know if you recognize the kitchen here, but
I actually do. Yeah, yeah,
Matt Cedillo's hideaway, Thunder Bay hideaway. You're
yeah.
always welcome back. Yeah, I've been looking at the history of the right for most of my academic career. So since I started my PhD at the University of Toronto, and I was interested in at first at the conservative nationalist, radical right wing movements in interwar Eastern Europe. So after World War One, and then so your question was like, so what do these things look like, or like the radical right?
Well, we see. I don't know how you would categorize the governments, but we see these. We see governments we see the Duterte in the Philippines. We see Erdogan in Turkey. We see Modi in India. We see waves of right wing governments taking power in Hungary, where you're an expert, and various other countries, Ukraine. We see in the United States of America the rise of Donald Trump and what he tends to represent. We see we see it throughout the world, and so I'm just wondering what are some of the common characteristics, whether we're talking about Brazil, Turkey, United States, Hungary. What are some of the these all across the world, various different cultures, but there are some very key commonalities to this brand of politics.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting because in all these different places you mentioned, and then of course in different times, uh, these movements play out in different ways, right? So, but there is something that holds them together, I think, both across like geographically. So, what we're seeing today with the resurgence of a radical right or a more extreme right wing, a populist right, looks similar in say Brazil and the United States, Hungary, Turkey, like all these places that you just mentioned. So there's commonalities, I think, and that are useful to look at, and then of course I think even across time. So the the right as we understand it today, the radical right and fascism as a sort of specific form, arguably in its modern understanding of it, takes root in the late 19th century. And it's what's interesting and what I think is a common feature across time. So from the late 19th century to the present is, sort of a populist and even revolutionary response to a set of material conditions, right? So the breakdown of the economy, the gap between the rich and the poor, that produces a desire for radical change, for example, right? Displacement amongst the working class and so forth. So in a lot of places we see historically and then today a resurgence of or a retreat into nationalism. So that's a key feature of it. It tends towards hyper masculinity as well. So it retreats into or it reproduces a form of what we would now call, say, traditional gender roles and traditional notions of the family. The strong man is part of that as well. So you see people like Trump or Erdogan, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Vladimir Putin in Russia, Viktor Orban in Hungary, sort of portray this very rugged individualist, strongman sort of form of leadership. There can be, in many cases, also an accommodation with the church or with religion as a part of that sort of resurgence of a retreat into some form of traditionalism. And then, of course, just a broader populism, right? So an appeal to the masses, but in a very populist sort of way. And these things are right now we're seeing that in, the United States and Brazil, in Hungary and in Russia, like a very similar sort of movement on that way on the right.
Yeah. So when you speak to like the returns of tradition, I mean, I'm thinking, I'm just thinking in terms of like how in India, with Modi, you see a definite call for a religious kind of conservatism and a definite that. I mean, you see in the United States of America, obviously, right now in this pandemic, all these churches going to reopen, and how that gets tied back to the right wing of capital. So, what is the role of capital in when we talk about the cultural aspects of it? What is the role of capital within this?
Well, it's an interesting question, right? Because um, if you look at the really radical, so and this is so the really radical right that's could be fascist or quasi-fascist, proto-fascist, or looks fascist in a sense, like Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany and some of the other fascist leaders of the interwar period. When you get that far to the right, to a sort of fascistic politics, there's a real antagonism with capital. Though capital itself seems to have a desire to collaborate with with that radical right wing, more revolutionary right wing faction. But in terms of the sort of the capital itself, finds, I think, the right wing useful, right? So the radical right populists, as a means of defending their own position in otherwise very uncertain and precarious times, right, for capital. So as we're seeing that today, so there's an accommodation on the right. The capital would be much more comfortable with a right wing populist leader, like, for example, Donald Trump. If we had someone who is much more, full blown fascist leader or fascist movement, which at least historically has tended to be very critical of capitalism. At least in the interwar period, they were critical of capitalism, critical of its sort of globalist elements. Capital being sucked out of a nation and sent somewhere else, and desiring a more radical sort of social change, right? So,
Yeah.
almost socialism for the nation, or socialism for that one particular ethnic group, or one particular national group, where there's a more equitable distribution of wealth. Capital itself would rather, I think, align with, and this is a sort of classical sort of leftist critique or analysis of fascism, but in the interwar period, you see this a lot, where the capital is willing to, if you're going to compromise with one of these radical elements, they're going to compromise with the radical right before they're going to compromise with the left, because the right has a place for capital. The right has a place for capitalist individualism. It fits with nationalism. It fits with that rugged sense of individualism. So ideologically and culturally, they're closer. And so, anyway, there's an accommodation there, I think. Though the more radical fascists, or the more radical right, certainly in the interwar period, and I would think even today, are fairly critical of capital itself.
Yeah, when you look at Trump, it's actually very interesting that in his initial cabinet, he had Steve Bannon, right, who would definitely fit into the traditional thing you're talking about, right? With this idea that that the United States was more than just an economy; it was also a civic society. And he had very very specific quotes that harken back to what you're saying, that would seem on his face critical of aspects of capital, and critical of imperialism, critical of being involved in all these. They would call it protectionism or something like that, or they call it people would call it like protection, or people would call it isolationism, something like that. But they would be critical of all those things, and like more inward, and more like we need to really destroy these elements inside the country that are destroying our national character, something like that, right? But he also had Tillerson, who was an oil man, right? Who was a direct oil executive. So in many ways, he represented just both the general thievery of capital, as well as these elements that would really push more towards what you're describing as this fascistic kind of society. And in support for Trump, you also saw many people, the resurgence of this concept of the 14 words, which is like we must protect, we must ensure a future for white children, something like that. And that is definitely, again, that's actually an economic plan, right, to ensure the future, an economic future for only white children. So I think that those elements are definitely there. So Trump, in many ways, his he actually had both elements there, and really, you know, both Rex Tillerson and Steve Bannon are gone now, but I think that it's definitely more in line with a kleptocracy than any kind of popular. Its appeal is very fascist, but then in practice, it's very much just a kind of general kleptocracy that kind of typical.
Yeah, exactly. So by a line, so they, appeal to the masses. Uh, so they appeal as populists, right? So you see that very clearly, for example, in Hungary right now, and we've seen that since 2010, since the current government came to power under Viktor Orban. You see that in both Bolsonaro or Erdogan in Turkey and Trump. I mean, they make these appeals to the masses, but it's pretty clear that it's a kleptocracy, right? In fact, I just wrote it's a perfect timing. I just got an email today saying it was going to be published. It's a book review of a book, a Hungarian scholar who, not a scholar, he was a former politician, but writing this commentary, and he calls it's not a kleptocracy, he calls it a mafia state, where you have like the elite in Hungary is functioning like a mafia, and it's a form of kleptocracy for sure, but using an appeal to the masses as populist appeal as a means of generating support. And a crisis like this, what we're seeing today with the pandemic, is a perfect opportunity to further their position, right? To further their politics and to increase control. So Hungary 2 weeks ago passed a law. It's basically an enabling act. So it's hard. It's almost hard to say that Hungary is even a democracy anymore. It gives a lot of power to the government and certainly to the prime minister. And one of the first things they did is use their power to further legislation that I don't know exactly what. I haven't had a chance to look into it more, but it attacks transgender rights. That was on day one, right? So in the name of the crisis, they take fuller power, more direct power, and appeal to the masses for that. This is in terms of national defense. It's good for the nation and so forth. We'll be able to defend the nation. But one of the first things is about gender. The other one, 2 days after that, they took control of 5 of the nation's universities, direct control of that. So, but they're using their popular appeal as a means of generating that sort of support for these kinds of, they're basically an enabling act that gives them a lot of power. And you see that, something similar in the United States, where Trump or in Brazil or wherever, where they're using a populist rhetoric and racist, openly racist rhetoric as well, to basically gain whatever support they need in order to act. But they're not acting in the name of the people. That's pretty clear. But somehow they've tricked, a vast majority. Hungary has a 2/3 majority in parliament, right? And so they've managed to convince people that this is for the good of the nation.
Yeah. So you mentioned the phrase "mafia state." Now, where you got that from? A colleague?
Yeah, no, it's a Hungarian writer named Bálint Magyar, Magyar, and so he writes of the Fidesz regime in Hungary is functioning like a mafia, right? But functioning on the level of the government. So he's just giving it a particular, kleptocracy, a very particular and very provocative name.
No, I think that very accurately describes a lot of what's happening in the United States of America. I mean, you have a situation with Donald Trump, bringing in his own family, his own son-in-law, his daughter, and putting them in very key positions of running the country in many different ways. I mean, on several different occasions now. So I mean, it actually reminds me a lot of Vince McMahon, how he runs the WWE. He kind of like that, bringing his son-in-law and his daughter. That's kind of like his his sons have been kind of excommunicated a little bit. That's kind of it's actually exactly like McMahon.
And he demands like fealty, right? He demands like a mafia don. And it's a really, really accurate metaphor, I think, for how these kinds of regimes work. So I think that would be worth looking at in terms of like how Trump is functioning, or McMahon.
Yeah, all right, man. But I know, I mean, it's just such a great phrase that I think it's gonna take legs. I think it's gonna have legs and really move. I know I'm gonna use it, so I just want to make sure I'm crediting the right person with this phrase
Yeah,
state
yeah.
before.
I can send you the reference.
Yeah, before I run with it. You know, I don't want to be accused of anything here. But yeah, no. So you are teaching now in Thunder Bay, Canada. You were here at Cal State Fullerton. That's where we met. Um,
Yeah.
so what happened? What was your experience like here in the United States? And yeah, what was it like teaching here in the U.S.?
Well, full disclosure, I'm Canadian, born and raised Canadian. So,
Full disclosure, I'm Canadian. That was
sorry.
no, full disclosure, I'm Canadian. That was a line so far.
I thought, yeah, because I'm not like an American who left the States for Canada. So actually, I was born and raised in Thunder Bay, and I'm back here teaching. So I'm in northwestern Ontario, small town, about 130,000 people. Well, less than that now, about 110,000 people. Just north of Duluth, Minnesota, about half an hour across the border from there. Yeah, so close to the States. And in 2008, I got a job in Cal State, at Cal State Fullerton. And it was interesting because it was coming just at the time of the crisis, right? So in many ways, I was really lucky to get a job. So I graduated in 2008. I was just finishing up my dissertation and got this job. So it was one of 3 jobs in all of North America that I was really qualified for that year because the market had really started to shrink. And Cal State Fullerton ran 3 job searches that year. And of the 3 that they ran in the history department, they were only able to hire 1. So my search was the one. So I was really lucky to get that job. Like 250 people applied for the job, whatever, right? So we were already starting to see the shrinking of like I was of the professoriate, right, with the full-time tenure track sort of thing, because it's really gone to a precarious workforce since then, part-time tenure track. So I arrived in 2008, and having sort of had my head buried in books for years, and it's what you need to do to finish your PhD. Not terribly politically active, but the first thing I realized is that I couldn't afford my job, right? So that was my first realization. It's like more money than I'd ever made before. But I realized because my wife couldn't work, because she was, for the first year or 2, she couldn't work because of the visa situation, that I was going to go into debt about $300 or $400 a month, right? Just for this job. And so that was I was politicized immediately because I was confused, right? And I was had delayed adulthood long enough that I kind of graduated with millennials. Right? I'm not I'm not a millennial, but I fucked around a lot and spent a lot of time.
Yeah,
and spent a lot of time. Yeah, spent a lot of time living in Europe as an English teacher and stuff. So I delayed adulthood. So I graduated not as a millennial, but with millennials, right? And it was really quite interesting to be, I'm really grateful for that because it gave me an understanding by living it, right? So I was politicized from day one. And then a year in, so in 2009, we had so going into my second year, we took a 10% pay cut, right? We were furloughed, and it was that jobless recovery. So it was coming out of that recession. And so we were taking pay cuts when the CEOs were, getting pay raises kind of thing, right? And there was the bailouts, but they're bailing out the companies and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going into my second year of teaching there, taking a 10% pay cut. And then I was really lucky to get involved with students at Cal State right away. The first one was Chirag Bhakta, an organizer in San Francisco. And he was in my very first class I ever taught. It was really awesome. I was teaching it was a summer course, so I hadn't even really started my job yet. It was summer 2008, and I was teaching this world history course, and I was teaching it from, a critical perspective, trying to get the voices of the dispossessed, to the people on the margins, to teach a course that was counteracted the Eurocentric narrative. And week 2, and Shrug met me in the hallway after. He goes, man, you talk the talk, but do you walk the walk? What do you do? What's your politics? What are you involved in? I'm like, oh, I just got here. I don't know. What can I get involved in?
Yeah.
And so he got me involved in social justice work on campus right from the beginning. And then I had these really great students. Like, and there's one I just saw, it's John Belici. John, you just posted something there. And there's really, really amazing people. So I worked at this sort of student-centered pedagogy that I was working on, and trying to really, I was really influenced. I shouldn't say that. If you know Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I hadn't read that, but I was kind of teaching kind of in that way. It's like, okay, what do you need to know? Or at least trying to understand where my students were coming from, because I came from Canada, they're in the United States, like completely different historical experiences, completely different set of material conditions.
Mhm.
You know, and I had, students who, Chicano students, Latino students, some African American students, a lot of students who were first generation going to university from low to middle class, working class families. So this is not my experience, right? So I really tried to learn from them and adjust curriculum as we went along. And I had some really great courses. One of them was the history of fascism that I started teaching at Cal State. Another one was the history of genocide. And out of these classes, we would start redefining fascism. We would start redefining genocide as it pertained to lived experiences of the people who lived, like who I was teaching. And we got really active in 2000, I guess it was 2010, 2009, 2010. So I was really active with students before the Occupy movement. We occupied, one of the groups I was working with, we occupied the president's office to get them to sign a declaration in defense of public education, which the guy didn't want to sign because it was too revolutionary, because it was a declaration, right?
Yeah.
So we were engaged in this. John, I guess he's listening, and he was involved in that as well. And we really got down and dirty with the stuff, and we were involved in Occupy and all that kind of stuff. So the longer I lived in the United States, in California, the more I realized, the need for like a revolutionary kind of politics, right? Because people's lives were depending on it. I had people, I had students who had to drop out because they got food poisoning and their medical bills were so high they couldn't afford to stay in school, or where the university would up tuition or up a fee by a couple $100 and they'd have to drop out because that was the straw that broke the camel's back. You had people, students who were raising money for an uncle's funeral because he was killed by the cops. You had, students who would say, I can't come to class, my uncle was shot. I can't come to class because my father's been deported. Just incredible stuff. I had one student whose entire family was murdered in front of her on Christmas, and she was there like back in January saying, look, I might have to leave class every now and again. That was my family that was killed, right? It was murdered over Christmas. So, these people coming back and they're working really hard. Anyway, so that was the kind of experience I had, and I got involved with faculty politics as well, and the CFA, the professors faculty association.
Yeah.
But by 2012 or 13, I was just like, I just couldn't. It felt like the nation. It was a nation on the verge of civil war or fascism, right? And it was I was ill. I was hospitalized. My wife was ill. We never had time for our kids. And we basically made the decision to leave, because I had one student who said to me, she said, it's like you want this to be like Canada. Like that's what your politics, you're working towards it. And it kind of dawned on me. It's like, well, yeah, there are places, not necessarily better, but different.
Yeah.
And why don't we go home, where we can maybe have a different life, and where if push comes to shove, there might be a better chance to say, for example, in Canada, we don't have to defend, or we don't have to build a public health system. We have to defend one that already exists. That's a completely different position to be fighting from.
Yeah.
Right. So we made the decision to leave in 2013, and I miss working with you and working with people like John Belici and these other people that Shirag and a whole host of people. But for the, for my own health, I had to leave. And so we came back. We fled. We had to take a loan from one of my friends, sent me money, about $15,000, so we could get home. Which gave me a sort of an understanding what it's like to leave. It's very hard to, to leave a country. It's very hard to just up and go. There's
Yeah.
things that really tie you down. But I was just, incredibly lucky and very privileged, obviously, to be able to make that decision and come home. But there was just felt like I was banging my head against the wall, right? And then just wondering, okay, well, what's the point of this? If I'm gonna have to fight, and as we were, maybe it might be better to do on home turf, kind of thing.
Yeah.
For the young kids at the time too.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers any of your questions.
Oh, that's question very actually, and transitions nicely next part. So you are in Canada now, in the town you grew up in, the city you grew up in. But it's an interesting question though, because Canada is not without its problems. There's a lot of things that are wonderful about Thunder Bay. It's a I'm very, maybe later we could talk about Finlandia and history of the struggle there, because that's always interesting to me, the struggle for the Finlandia, the battle for Finlandia. But the condition of Native peoples, the United States is awful. I mean, there's no question about that. The condition of Native peoples, a much larger percent of Canada than they do the United States. It's not only more pronounced there, but or everywhere. It's much more like it's like on the news like every night. The big scapegoat, the big thing here over and over. When I was in Canada, was really horrible denigration of the Native peoples there, and as both people were being oppressed and also people were being scapegoated like every day. Yeah. So can you speak a little bit to some of the issues there in Canada?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was interesting coming back because going back into the classroom and like I had to switch my teaching right away because there's that consciousness was not like with my students back in 2013 in the fall. I came back. The students in Thunder Bay just didn't have that same consciousness as the students in California, but that's because their material conditions and the political situation was entirely different, right? So like they just didn't have. That's changed. That's changed fundamentally. In the last 5 years or 6 years since I've been back. I guess, geez, it's almost 7 years now. 7? Geez, okay. But the material conditions have degenerated far enough that there's a more radical energy amongst the student body, or at least the politicization. So people recognizing that politics are you can't avoid it. And the problems in Canada, of course, are historical, right? So they're different than the problems in the United States. They're very similar. So they're rooted in settler colonialism and imperialism. So Canada was an empire within an empire, or to say that the Canadian nation building followed an imperial pattern within the British Empire. So it was still an imperial process. The province of Ontario had a Department of Colonization up until, I don't know when it changed, but early up into the early 20th century. So where I live, it was opened up by Southern Ontario, and the Northern Ontario was just a colony of Southern Ontario. It was for the exploitation of resources primarily, and for the settling of settlers, like white settlers, which required the displacement of or resulted in the displacement of Indigenous peoples, right? Which 2015 or 16, a report came out, the Truth and Reconciliation report, and called it a cultural genocide, which I agree with. I think it's absolutely genocidal what's happened. So our relationship with Indigenous peoples in Northern Ontario is similar to the rest of Canada, and very similar to what would happen in the United States, in that it was a history of displacement and assimilation, or an attempted assimilation, and also elimination as well. In the United States, you waged war, right? The government waged war against the Indigenous people, the Indian Wars. In Canada, we didn't have the resources to do that. So in the late 19th century, there was, in the context of Canadian nation building, because we became a country in 1867, we built railways, and we're trying to open up the West as a means of exploiting it and settling it with white settlers. and taming the land through colonization, there was a realization that it would be a very costly thing to try and subdue and colonize and subdue the indigenous population with military means. So what was happening in the United States wasn't going to happen in Canada. So we have this sense in Canada that our history was different, that it's cleaner, that we did better by our indigenous people because we didn't kill them, right? We didn't mobilize an army against them. Though in part that wasn't true too, because the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was formed in the late 19th century as a means of subduing a Métis uprising just west of here on the prairies in Manitoba. So there is the militarization, but our solution to that was residential schools, basically civilizing the native out of the native, right? So assimilating them through education, but also rendering them useful right, to the Canada that was being built, right? So that the girls would be trained, not only taken away from their houses and taken away from their languages, taken away from their culture, but would also be trained so they could be domestic servants. Boys could then also, could work in industry or could work on farms or so forth. And I think you're frozen there, Matt. Can you still hear me? Hey, John. Just wait for Matt to come back. He's disappeared from my screen. I can't hear him. He went dark. Hi, Sean. How are you? There he is.
All right. So essentially, cultural genocide is what you were saying.
Yeah, I like how you come back on and just say essentially cultural genocide.
Yeah, I'm a professional. I mean, all right. So we were talking about cultural genocide there. We're talking about the kind of very similar to the United States with the boarding schools. So.
Yeah. And that's the result. I mean, we're still dealing with the trauma of that. Like the residential schools, like in Thunder Bay, I'm a historian, but not a historian of dates, as like Juan Villa and John and Sean will attest to that. It was when did the last one in Thunder Bay close? The 60s or 70s, and some of them lasted up into the 80s. Right? So, I was born in 1969. So like there were residential schools well into my lifetime.
Yeah.
And so Indigenous communities are dealing with the trauma of that still, the intergenerational trauma.
You mentioned the Mounties essentially being formed about to put down an uprising, but the Mounties were actually recently in action putting down another uprising, were they not?
Yeah. I mean, so there's that it's the way Canadians, we have a problem with being able to really honestly look at our past, I think, because we have this sense we can look at the United States and say, well, just look at that's the evil empire, right? Like that's where you mobilized an army, against the indigenous people and stuff. And we never did that, right? So yeah, and we have the police, but that's different than the army. But is it really all that different? I don't think it is. And you're right. So the RCMP right now, has mobilized to put down protests, most recently against like oil and gas, right? So, and in Canada, there was the Oka crisis. There was a crisis in Mohawk territory back in the 90s, and the army was mobilized against the Mohawk warriors then. So right. we do have that history as well. We're just not very good in Canada at actually at actually facing up to it and understanding it for what it is.
So Canada's typical thing is to either compare themselves to the U.S., which is just the worst place in the world, the most vicious, murderous place in the world. And then uh, when it is exactly like the U.S., then just to lie about it.
Yeah, or find a way to wiggle out of it, right? And say, well, it's not quite the same thing. It's different. We're somehow better. We're more. Uh, we're we're nicer. I don't know. Like, it's just finding a way to look to be able to see the differences as opposed to the similarities.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we were also very, I think, handcuffed and blinded in Canada because we don't have a very critical understanding of the British Empire. So, the the crimes of Churchill, for example, if in multiple crimes, or his advocation of using gas to subdue the Kurds after World War I by dropping gas bombs out of airplanes. We just don't know that. We know about his role in World War II, and we know about we're going to fight on the beaches, we'll never surrender, that kind of that go get 'em attitude. But we really know, I would say, pretty much nothing about the darker side of the British Empire. And of course, we were born of that, and our nation building had an imperial. It was a colonial project within a British colonial project, and we need to do a much better job of recognizing that and teasing that out. But we can't, because we don't often have a very honest assessment or critical assessment of Canadian history. And beyond that, we're handcuffed by the fact that we don't have a critical or full understanding of the British Empire.
So what is the current scholarship look like on John A. Macdonald right now? What are people becoming more critical, less critical, greater celebration, less celebration? Where's that at?
It's interesting. So John A. Macdonald is the first Prime Minister of Canada. So the first Prime Minister of Canada. There's a school a primary school in Thunder Bay called Sir John A. Macdonald. So we have schools named after him. There's statues and so forth, right? So he's seen as one of the fathers of Confederation, the first great Canadian, got the railway built and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, he was a drunk, but that's just more funny than anything, right? So that's like as dark, the skeleton in the closet that we will talk about. But in recent years, so especially since the Truth and Reconciliation report came out, I'm pretty sure it was the summer of 2015. There's been huge debate. So do we change the name of that school, for example? Do we take down the statues of him? Do we put up a plaque that speaks to his role? Because it was under his leadership that the first residential schools were built, right? And there's clear language of cultural genocide within that. So on the one hand, there's been significant discussion and pushback, or a significant sort of criticism of John A. Macdonald and his legacy based on a rereading of the history. And that's not just in Indigenous communities where they've been saying this for a long time, right? It's also in non-Indigenous communities. So, the settler, like the descendants like myself of, the white settlers, and who also recognize the need to think very critically about this and maybe not celebrate that. But then there's been pushback both from within the historical profession and outside of that. It's like, well, look, and the big one is, if it's like, okay, well, yes, he was one of the architects of the residential schools, which has been identified as an instrument of cultural genocide. But he was acting, and this is the big one, I'm sure you've heard it too. It's like, well, we can't use the present to judge the past, right? So what he did today is clearly wrong, but how would he have known that at the time, right? So it can't be racist if he didn't know it was racist. It can't be genocidal if, well, we don't have the term genocide until after World War II, but it can't be some form of genocide if everyone else was thinking along the same lines. How can you expect someone to act differently when he was acting by the standards of his time? And what I would say is, okay, fine. Let's not judge him by the standards of the present. Let's judge him by the standards of the past. And there's a lot of historical evidence to suggest, like there's doctors and educators and even religious people at the time that said, your reasons behind this residential school, this program, this is wrong. This is immoral. This is going to destroy their culture. So, and that's amongst
Yeah.
the settlers who were poor, who were dissenting voices. And of course there was resistance amongst the indigenous population from day one. And if you reread stories of Columbus or any the early so-called discoverers, right, of the Americas, like there was pushback from day one. There was resistance, right?
Mhm.
So we don't have to judge John A. Macdonald by the standards of the present. Judge him by the standards of the past. He was still a bastard, right? Okay, that's me editorializing, but
Okay,
like,
so in trouble here, but we have a question here. What work would you recommend to understand Canadian First Peoples history from their own perspective? So, what would be a good reader for our audience here in the United States to hear from the First Nations of Canada from their own?
Rosa, that's a good question. I wish I could, off the top of my head, give you a good answer to that, because I'm not a Canadian historian. So I'm a specialist in Eastern Europe and in particular Hungary. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think, and I know there's a lot of good ones out there. So okay, a good one, and I've been doing more reading from of people who've been writing from a present perspective. But a really good one is Tanya Talega, Seven Fallen Feathers, which actually talks about, looks into an inquiry in Thunder Bay where there's a number of Indigenous students who had come here from, so we don't have residential schools anymore, but we have really poor education in the Indigenous communities north of here. Like we're talking about 300, 400, 500 miles, like these flying communities, or they only have ice roads in the wintertime, right? They have to, drive across the lakes and so forth to get stuff up there. So to get high school education, they have to come to Thunder Bay, right? So they have to leave their communities and they live here. And there was a number of them who died or were killed. It died in very mysterious, nefarious sort of situations. So like, drowned in the river and stuff. Right? So Tanya Talega wrote this book, Seven Fallen Feathers, which is a good introduction to that. There's another really great book called Inconvenient Indian. I'm pretty sure that's the title. I could send Matt some titles maybe.
Yeah. Send me the titles and I'll put it in this thread so people can.
Yeah, but there's really great stuff out there. I'm just like drawing a blank. So on actual titles.
Yeah. Did I Don't Know More begin in Canada?
Yeah.
I feel like I Don't Know More began in Canada, right?
Yeah, really interesting. I think it would be worth looking at it if you know anything about Black Lives Matter, to look at it in a comparative context, because they both emerge at about the same time, right? And it's women, women who start this movement.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely would be interested in looking at how that is. Oh, here we got another question here. How do Indigenous people convince RCMP membership that white communities that directly benefit from that employment to understand the importance of halting the pipelines if the bulk of the the Mounties pensions are invested in the pipeline industry itself? So basically, essentially, the Mounties are beating people up, and their pension is tied up in the pipeline. That's a horrible. Wow, that is terrible.
How do Indigenous people convince RCMP membership that white communities are directly? So how, is it like, is the question basically like how?
Well, I mean, this question, there's also information here. Like the Mounties, have apparently have so much of their pensions are tied up that the pension fund is tied up in the oil industry itself. Like, it just seems like
You're right, Rosa. It's always women. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, this question just points to just how tied up, how bound up the whole society is in the oppression of Indigenous people.
No, exactly, right? Because I mean, even if like, because I don't know the details here, right? But even if the pensions, our CMP pensions, were not invested directly in the pipelines, our entire economy is tied up to is tied to a system in which the pipelines, and resource extraction is necessary, or is a basis of that, right? So either directly or indirectly, you're being, you're tied up to that, right? So yeah, I don't know about the pensions themselves. And unfortunately, in terms of like how do indigenous people do this? Like, I mean, they've been calling us out, this kind of stuff like that, structural violence, structural racism. I mean, they've been calling this out again, like I said, since day one, right? Like if you like from it's back like 400 or 500 years going back, they're fully aware of what's going on, and it's not so much the job of indigenous people to convince the membership in the white communities, right? It's up to us. Like, we have to do that work. We just have to, first I say, we just have to listen, right? Because they have a lot to say about that injustice, because they live it, right? They've been fighting it, right? Fighting it for generations. But yeah, Amanda, that's a good question.
So, getting back to what is your field of expertise? We're talking about the rise of the Hungarian right, specifically. How do you see the rise of the current day government? How do you historicize the current government in Hungary, and its relationship to just Hungarian history of the 20th century?
That's a good question. So, Hungary was a conservative nationalist right-wing government between World War I and World War II. And then they sided with the Nazis, or were part of that, invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, and were on the losing side of World War II. After World War II, Hungary, like the rest of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, becomes part of the Soviet bloc, right? So it becomes a communist country from 1948, 49 until 1989. So they have 40 years of socialism, state socialism, communism. And as a colony, not a colony, so that's how some people would see it, sort of as an appendage of the Soviet Union. In 1989, the wall comes down. By 1990, there's the first free elections. And so you have democracy, right? That a liberal democracy is formed. And it sweeps through all of Eastern Europe at the time. And it's pretty interesting because so the first government was sort of a center-right government. And in the second set of elections, it was the Reform Socialist Party took power. And this was very similar to other countries in Eastern Europe. The Reform Communists came back as the left, right, the socialist parties, and they more or less had power up until the beginning of the 21st century, when we see the radical or sort of right-wing movement starting to return, anti-Semitism and so forth and populist nationalism starts to is resurgent by the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, in part because of what happens to the Hungarian economy and Hungarian people as they start to integrate themselves more into globalization, which is neoliberal, right? And it's about, so they see that as a new form of colonization, and a new form of imperialism, and where they're on the losing end of that stick, where they're getting structural loans from maybe not the IMF or the World Bank, but that kind of stuff, right? So like the West, or capital, global capital, I'm not sure you could really locate it geographically, but in the historic West, global capital is being invested, but Hungarians are losing out, right? Cost of living is going up, pensions are being depleted, and the quality of life is going down, and a gap between the rich and the poor is starting to appear more aggressively by the end of the 1990s, right?
Yeah.
In the early part of the 90s, people were sort of willing to forgive that, because what was a period of transition, and of course, there's going to be some hiccups, there's going to be some sacrifices we have to make. Yeah. But by the beginning of the 21st century, so the early 2000s, people were starting to get to rebel against that, and a sort of radical or more revolutionary type of energy is starting to build, or critical energy is starting to build. And in 2004, Hungary becomes part of the European Union. And there's a whole host of laws that they kind of have to adhere to, and human rights and stuff. And they had to sort of prove to the West, prove to Western Europe that they were worthy of being included in their club, right? And there was a bit of resentment that grew up around that, and a politics of resentment around that political and cultural shift and that social shift, but also the economic damage that was being done as a result of globalization, and then the European Union as a kind of a neoliberal or structure within global neoliberal capitalism. So you get this energy that's starting to build, this critical energy, and the left wing is in power. So the reform communists are in power, but like Labor, the Labor Party in Great Britain, or like the New Democratic Party in Canada, or the Democrats in the United States, which is more centrist, but they're abandoning their proletarian base. They're abandoning the people, right? And they're the ones who become agents of these neoliberal reforms, where it's about austerity. So it's the left who's in power, and they're being forced by the demands of the European Union to implement austerity measures, so that gap between the rich and the poor is growing, the social safety net is disappearing, and there's a politics of resentment that's starting to build up. The problem is that it's the left that's doing this, sort of like the British Labour Party, right? Who seem to have abandoned their base, sold out to the capitalists, to the European Unionists. And then you have the legacy of communism. That shadow of the Cold War hangs over Hungary. So there is no legitimate left. The left is in disarray, as it is in other countries, but there's a historical sort of hangover here too, because of the discredit that the communist movement and radical revolutionary socialism had fallen into as a result of that Soviet experiment in the second half of the 20th century. So at least my research, which suggests and point to this, that the only direction that more radical critical energy could go in is to the right. And there was one party, the Fidesz party, which had set out as I remember in the early 90s, they were the young, you had to be under the age of 30, you had to be kind of cool and hip to be part of the Fidesz party. It was this orange wave. So they were sort of center right sort of youth-based party. They made a decision in the mid 90s or late 90s to change their politics and to move more aggressively into the radical right or the populist right. So they lost a lot of their base, a lot of their support in the late 90s. But by the mid to like 2005, 2006, they were starting, or even earlier than that, they came into a coalition briefly as a part of the coalition government, and they had started. They had made the decision to reposition themselves on the populist right. By 2010, the left was completely discredited in Hungary because the ruling Hungarian Socialist Party, one of their leaders, admitted, it was one of those things, his mic was still on and was still running. He says, "Holy shit, yeah, boy, we really pulled the wool over those. We pulled the wool over their eyes. We lied. We basically lied about Hungary's economic situation."
That's funny.
And that was enough to cause, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, or one of them. And so in the next round of elections in 2010, the left was just decimated. The Hungarian Fidesz party, with their Christian Democratic, the Christian Democratic Party partners, they formed a coalition, and with 2/3 of the majority in 2010. By 2012, they had rewritten the constitution that declared that Hungary is a Christian country.
Oh, wow.
We have a 1,000-year history in the Carpathian Basin of defending Europe against the East, against non-Christians, all that kind of stuff. We believe in a traditional family, and so we start to see that populism and that traditionalism that we started this interview with. We were talking about that, and hyper-nationalism, and even sort of a misogynist, patriarchal, paternalism sort of being written into these laws. And that becomes the fundamental law of Hungary. That's their constitution. That's 2012. They win again in 2014 with 2/3 majority, and 2018 with a 2/3 majority. And they've been slowly over the last 10 years now, because it's 2020, chipping away at civil society, chipping away at the judiciary, chipping away at education. So first it was the public schools, where they changed the curriculum. Then they came after, well, they're coming, after the university. That's after humanities and social sciences. So they're chipping away. There's that full blown attack, a full frontal attack. They've created, the independence, the Hungarian, the Academy of Science they created a secondary set of institutions where the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, where a lot of independent research was being done. It was funded by the government, but it was independently run. That's effectively disappeared now and completely undermined. The government created a ministry and it's under their control now. And as I said at the beginning, in the last 2 weeks, the government has taken full control over 5 of Hungary's universities. So it's part of a much longer sustained attack, a very patient, decade-long attack on civil society. We're seeing the complete erosion of that. And then now in the midst of the crisis, they've passed this essentially an enabling law. And I've been talking to some of my colleagues in Hungary, and no one's talking about it, right? Because the COVID crisis is that those are the headlines. That's what everyone's talking about, right? So it's part of a really long descent. Well, I would see it as a descent, further and further along to the right.
Yeah. It would really seem like during that period when they called them the color revolutions or what have you in the late 80s, early 90s, that so much of Eastern Europe seemed like they were promised kind of to be absorbed within like the imperialist core. But it was called democracy, right? It's called democracy. You're going to get democracy, and democracy is going to bring you all these like material benefits. Democracy is going to mean that instead of having 2 pairs of jeans, you can have 10 pairs of jeans. Instead of, democracy is going to bring you, instead of 1 line of cars, you can have 5 line of cars. Democracy is going to bring you all these things, right? And what ended up happening instead is that they didn't actually get invited in to be colonizers. They got invited in as colonies. I think that was pretty much kind of the fate of Eastern Europe. And if you look at Yugoslavia, one of the few places to actually kind of actively resist that. And, Yugoslavia was never actually fully in the Soviet bloc. So they got torn apart. They got torn apart, and they got bombed, and they were destroyed. So, I mean, the compromises made with the so-called West. I mean, the imperialist core the imperialist core never invites you to be an equal member. I mean, it invites you to. It invites you in as something where profit can be extracted from individuals, but from nations as a whole.
Yeah, and that became clear already in the early 90s. Yeah. People paying attention, right? And that it was pretty clear pretty early, I think, for people who were sort of watching, and able to see it, that this was a new colonial relationship. So that by 2002, 2003, when they were getting closer to being actually led into the EU, there was a movement. It was like say no to the EU. It was the translation into English, and there's a really great poster. And some of the, I've shown it to my students before, so some people actually listening here might have seen this. They might remember. There's a hand reaching out, and it's got a swastika on it, and then there's the Hungarian hand reaching to shake hands, and then below that, it's the communist hand. Sorry, the communist hand and the Hungarian hand shaking. And then below that is the EU, the European hand, and the Hungarian hand. Mm-hmm. And it said, and that was and this is where history is really important, right? Because people, they didn't even need words on that poster. It's like, look, we collaborated with the Nazis, with the Soviets, and now the EU is extending the hand. That's right. And the slogan at the bottom was like, it's possible also to say no, right? We don't have to do this. Like, what have we learned from our history? Yeah. When we cooperate with the colonizers, we're fucked, right? This is not good for us. So why are we doing this again? Right. So that history becomes really, really important. But then, as I said, it was the populist right, the hyper nationalist right, that was able to mobilize that and take advantage of that politically, because there was nowhere for that radical energy to go on the left. Absolutely nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, absent of that. I mean, so Yeah, and I'm saying like the entire Soviet period. I mean that I think that people get a little unrealistic sometimes about what was even possible, because if you look at the today Cuba, right, you have all these kind of right wing Cubans. I was told by one right wing Cuban, like, well, if the Castro regime goes when Raul was still around, but the government still, right, the socialist government, if they were being overthrown, then that would be great, and it'll open up, Cuba will open up the world. I'm like, what do you think Cuba's going to look like if that happens? And he said Japan, right? Like it's going to be this powerful capitalist world nation, that is going to be one of the great things. But Japan's part of the imperial core. Like Japan is part of world imperialism. Japan is Japan. The Japanese, working class people have their problems just as they have them in the United States and all of. But the country as a whole is part of an imperialist, world economy.
Yeah.
And Cuba would not be welcomed into the world imperialist economy as a fellow imperialist. It's not going to happen. And that certainly did not happen in Eastern Europe, and it certainly wouldn't happen in Cuba. So I think people sometimes, like they don't
Yeah.
talk of the world as it exists.
No, you're absolutely right. Like the what happened. I mean, Eastern Europe and Cuba, the two different, like very, very different geographically, historically, and so forth. But I think you're right. Like, there's no way they're gonna, if they just transition to democracy, that they'd all of a sudden be an equal partner at the table, right? Like that's just not going to happen. And you're right. Like Japan, the history of Japan, it emerges out of isolation or seclusion in the late 19th century, but it does so. It manages to do so on an imperial footing, right, very quickly, and as it modernizes and so forth. So it's got a century and more of being a that's East Asian imperial core,
Yeah.
and that's part of its history. It's really, really important. Yeah, Cuba just doesn't have that. Yeah, yeah.
So okay, so we're at the hour mark. So do you have anything to promote? Anything our audience should know about? Anything that you got in the works?
No, I mean, probably not. I
You're
mean,
editing the books.
not anything that I'm sure anyone's going to jump up and read, and you shouldn't order it from Amazon anyway.
That's right.
Uh, but yeah, there's two edited collections are coming out. One of them is on Hungarian geography and nationalism after Trianon, which has happened exactly 100 years ago. So Hungary was on the losing end of World War One. They lost 2/3 of their country afterwards as part of the peace treaty, the Treaty of Trianon. So colleagues of mine were looking at the response of geographers and geography to that, which is kind of interesting, the politicization of geography. And then the other one's on post-Soviet identities in Central Asia, that I'm a co-editor on that book as well. It's coming out. Well, it's going to come out as soon as I finish my work on it. So both of those should come out this year.
Okay.
But pretty academic kind of stuff, like it'd be interesting. Yeah, and but anything to promote would be like free thinking and revolution. Like that's what I would promote right now. Don't worry about reading my stuff. It'll be there after the revolution, maybe. So yeah, I would read. There's lots of good stuff out there. Like, for example, Matt Cedillo.
Oh yeah.
This way, Matt Cedillo's work, and just
Yeah.
listening to these sorts of and getting engaged in conversations like this is amazing. As I've been watching the ones you've been doing, I'm going, that's so cool. And then you called me up or you just like said, hey, do you want to do one? I'm like, yeah.
That's the way it works. I mean, like I've been inviting people, and people like might get mad about like, hey, how come you don't have such and such and such and such? And believe me, I've been asking all kinds of people. The people I have on are the people who say yes. So before you decide to like get mad at me about what I do or don't have, first of all, I don't even have to do this. Second of all, like the people that come on are the people who say yes. So that's that. So
Yeah.
and thank you for saying yes.
Yeah. Well, and if I do end up writing something, I'll let you know. And if you want, you can have me back.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, there you go. There we go. Yeah, and you should bring me. You should zoom me into your classroom. I'm doing all kinds of workshops and stuff.
No, and I've seen that. It'd be great. Our semester just ended, so we're done. We're done. Sorry, but hey, there's always the fall, right?
Always
Like this ain't going anywhere anytime soon, and we got a lot of work to do. A lot of work to do.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Oh, look, it's Lee.
Yeah. Okay. See you guys.
Take care.
Nice to see everybody on all the comments. That's great.
Yeah, it's a lot of Cal State Fullerton in the house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Leo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Take care. Good night, everybody.